his car. He didn't say a word to me. He did not say a word to me. He was furious. He walked at a great pace and left.
John Howard doesn't get rattled, but it was an awkward period because you could just sense that some people were starting to say, would this be a one-term government? And, you know, John Howard has worked so hard to get to become Prime Minister. He still had 50 million things he wanted to do.
There was one issue John Howard was hell-bent on tackling: reform of the waterfront.
The reform of the waterfront was holy grail for the Howard government. And we realised when we got into government, in fact we realised before we were in government, when we were in opposition, that we really only had one window to make the reform, and that was in our first term.
There was a legendary scorn about the inefficiency of the Australian waterfront. You know, the famous story about the lady in Charleville who's told that there's a cyclone coming, and she says, "Oh, don't worry, the wharfies won't land it."
I mean, the idea that Australia could have a worse waterfront record than some landlocked country in Africa, which was, you know, one of the more extreme examples we had, but which was true.
The waterfront was always two-pronged. One was to improve the economy, to improve our exports, but the other was that it was a totemic issue to try to reduce union power in this country.
John Howard's first step was to change the workplace laws. Compulsory unionism was banned, and the government imposed massive fines on any union that staged an illegal strike. The Maritime Union of Australia was the government's target.
Well, one of the justifications for reform would be a strike on the waterfront initiated by the unions over some really ridiculous thing, as is often the case.
That then would allow the IR legislation to come into play, allow a dismissal of the workforce, and allow a new workforce to come in.
But John Howard knew changing the laws was not enough.
Are you able to talk to me now, or...?
The government needed an insider, a tough-minded businessman who shared their firm resolve to break the union's monopoly. That man, Chris Corrigan.
There was absolutely no chance of a negotiated outcome or of a gradual change. This industry will only change with a radical solution.
On the 12th of March 1997, Chris Corrigan met with Peter Reith and John Sharp.
Sorry I'm late. I simply said to them, this is not going to be done in a conventional way. The only way to keep the waterfront functioning is to have an alternate workforce, and that workforce is not going to be trained satisfactorily in Australia.
12 days later, John Sharp and Peter Reith took a radical plan to the Prime Minister. John Howard signed off on what would become known as the interventionist strategy.
Although Peter Reith and John Sharp were running the policy on a day-to-day operational level, I was very heavily involved because I wanted this reform achieved.
You know, first big dispute under the Howard government was going to be the test of metal. And having John Howard on side was, from my point of view, it was it.
6 months passed. On the 18th of September 1997, a meeting was called in Treasury Place, Melbourne, to discuss the progress of waterfront reform. Chris Corrigan had been busy planning an alternate workforce.
I had an obligation, in my view, to tell them certain things, to tell them the broad outline of what I was contemplating, and in particular to tell them that my plans may well result in significant redundancies on the waterfront. And I think I had an obligation to tell them that. As I say, you can't bring the country to a grinding halt, you know, and just leave the government in the dark.
And Chris Corrigan made this perfectly clear. They'll be in a position to sack the workforce under the new legislation, and if he had to sack the workforce, he would require new labour.
In a separate meeting with John Sharp and Peter Reith, Chris Corrigan revealed exactly what he wanted. He needed money, government money, to fund redundancy payments for sacked workers.
I put it to them in much more specific terms what I required and the scale of the numbers that were involved.
Okay.
The scale was something like 150 million for us alone in terms of redundancy payments.
I remember saying to myself, well, I suppose we'll have to sign up to the industry standard on redundancies. But it was incredibly generous. I mean, it was just completely over the top, basically.
With the funds guaranteed, Chris Corrigan could proceed with his top-secret plan to train an alternate workforce. The location? Dubai.
I want to make it absolutely clear, I never told anybody in government that I had arrangements for people to be trained in Dubai. Never.
My memory of it is that Chris was looking. He was thinking about setting up a third-party workforce. He was looking at training them in a number of places, both in Australia and offshore, and Dubai would have been one of those possible offshore sites.
I don't think I even knew Dubai was a port, you know. Shocking ignorance, I suppose. I just hadn't done enough flying, I suppose.
Keeping a plan like this under wraps was never going to be easy. 2 months later, it blew. An unknown source contacted the head of the MUA, John Coombs.
And he then told me that Dubai was going to be the place that was going to be trained. They didn't have a date of departure, but they had a number of ex-army and ongoing servicemen that were going to be sent to Dubai. And that's when I asked the question, where is this starting from? He said, where would you like to start? I said, well, at the top. He said, John Howard.
On the 3rd of December 1997, the government was forced to answer questions about the nature of its involvement.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Workplace Relations and Small Business. Have you or any member of your staff or department or any consultant advising the government on waterfront matters had any discussions with Michael Wells, Peter Kilfoyle...
You know, the Labor Party were asking me these questions in the House about all these, you know, shelf companies, which I'd never heard of. I mean, just knew nothing, and names of people I'd never heard of. It wasn't as if I'd had somebody ring up and say, well, Mr Reith, we've planned this huge operation and, you know, we've got cranes organised and we've got 50 blokes or whatever it was. I mean, I obviously had no information of that sort.
The Honourable Minister for Workplace Relations and Small Business.
Mr Speaker, I must say I don't know any of those names of either the companies or the individuals that the member has asked me of, so the answer is no.
Well, I think Peter would have known that there was a plan to train people. And what Peter was doing that day was focusing on one part of the question, not answering the whole of the question, which is very stock in trade in politics.
I actually rang up Corrigan and P&O, Richard Hine, and said, well, what do you blokes know about this?
And he said to me, you better tell me, are you training people in Dubai?
Both of them basically said, well, it's not us. I think that was the answer I got.
And I said, well, I don't know that I want to tell you that, but if you're asking me deliberately, yes.
The plan was exposed. The government was now under fire.
Prime Minister, would you be prepared to use mercenaries on the wharf?
What an extraordinary question.
Well, this has been raised in London.
I'm in favour of everything that's strictly in accordance with the laws of Australia.
The union movement mobilised its members, calling on its vast networks to stop the Dubai enterprise in its tracks.
Instead of Reith saying it's a defining moment in industrial relations, it'll be a defining moment, the beginning of the end of the careers of Reith and Howard proprietors. That was the most significant rebut of the government and Patrick's attempts to replace our workforce. We got them expelled, kicked out of Dubai. They were all the next morning in Singapore on their way home.
Johnny Howard is his name. Johnny Howard is his name. Busting unions is his game. Busting unions is his game. Reith is in the caper too. Reith is in the caper too.
Chris Corrigan wasn't going to be outfoxed by the unions. He struck a deal with the MUA's traditional foe, the National